In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use the cube projection tool with seamless textures to create quick and dirty UVs perfect for prototyping. So this is a prototype crossbow that I made, and as you can see, it does have some texture on it. It's a very low resolution texture, but it does have texture on it. And I was able to create the UVs for this very quick, very easily. And the whole purpose of this is so that I could throw this into a game, see what it looks like without spending all the extra time on texturing and UV unwrapping and all that kind of stuff. Even the model itself was created very crudely, again, just so that I can kind of inspect it in the game, or maybe even just to hold the place until the finished object is done. That's basically what prototyping is all about. I just want to point out a couple of things on this object before we get started. I've separated some of the geometry to show you that, like, this piece here is made entirely out of wood. This piece right here is entirely out of metal. Here's a burlap piece. We have this piece made out of rope. Here's another rope piece right here, and so on and so forth, okay? All of this stuff can be combined together like this piece right here actually has the burlap and the wood. This technically has, even though it looks like just wood at a glance, actually has three materials associated with it. It has this wrought iron, it has this wooden beam, and it has this cross-cut wood. If you look at the materials, you can see iron, cut end, and wood beam. So a lot of this stuff is actually done that way. This one has iron, wood, and cut end. This has wood, cut end, and burlap. This is done very similar to the way I showed you how to color without UVs, except this method actually requires UVs. The good news is you can create those UVs instantly using the cube projection tool. So as you can see, this piece right here has iron, cut end, and wood beam. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Let's jump over to the UV editing window and get started. So I'm going to hide everything other than what we're focusing on. So this piece right here, doesn't matter what's over here right now. This is just, you have to think of this more of as a guide texture. It's not actually the texture that's being used here. So this texture actually comes from this list. And this list is really just stuff that I added using this open command, okay? So what I want to do is temporarily unlink that. So we're looking at just this. I'm going to go into edit mode and select all. All of the geometry for this thing is piled up in one big mess. This piece right here is one of the cut ends. There's another cut end right here and another one right there. I'm going to select all three of those together. So what you're technically looking at here is the cut end texture. And if I go ahead and put that on, this is what you would see. So let's take a look at this bottom piece here. That's this square. If I grab this and move it around, you can see it moving over here. So I can put this anywhere inside this texture. Maybe I like this over here better. Same thing with this. So there's that shape. That's this one right here. Put that somewhere where it feels most natural and then drop it down. Same thing over here. The idea here is that you can manipulate what your surface looks like without putting much thought into a UV atlas. If you look at all this stuff together, everything's just piled in. Let's take a look at the wood beam texture. Notice it takes up the same exact space. Doesn't really make any difference. That's basically this stuff right here. This is a really good example because this piece of the geometry actually extends outside of my workspace. I would have to actually look at this with the repeating texture to understand how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the repeating texture on. And there you go. So what's going on here is I'm using a seamless texture. So in other words, it doesn't matter if you go off this side of it because it's just going to continue where it left off on this side. Again, I can put this on and you can see that happening. This edge right here is invisible because it's literally just repeating itself. This texture was created by me, and all I did was I took a picture of a piece of wood, and then I did some editing in Photoshop to make it look this way. I'm not going to be covering that in this course. That kind of falls under texture mapping. But if this is something that interests you, look up seamless textures, and there's plenty of information online about this. Let me select all, and you can see that a lot of the geometry actually falls outside of this workspace. So it doesn't really matter where any of this stuff is. What matters is what it looks like out here. And what I did was I just ran an automatic projection tool called Cube Projection. I'm going to do it right now. So I just basically hit Cube Projection. And Cube Projection kind of jumbled it all up in this big mess. The problem is some of these UVs are sideways. So it's really easy to detect that over here. You can see all the rectangles that are going in the wrong direction. So I literally just went in here and grabbed the ones that were most obvious first and rotated them 90 degrees. And I continued doing this until they were all going vertically. You could take your time and do a better job, but for me, this is probably good enough for a prototyped object. I want to point out how the rest of this is done. So in order to associate this texture or this texture, it's just like the previous lecture where you just go in here and you choose the edges. I'm going to select all, and let's say we wanted the whole thing to be wood beam. So I would just assign the whole thing to be wood beam. And then let's say we want these to be cross cuts. So we select those and we choose cut end and assign. So now those are all that texture. And then this was iron. And that's basically how you do that. You're probably wondering how I got these textures in here in the first place. This is Cycles Render. Same exact thing that I did before. I add a new slot. I give it a name. I'm just going to call this new texture or new material. The biggest difference is instead of choosing a diffuse color, I'm just going to choose this drop-down list over here, put it on image texture, then I can browse my hard drive for any image file, or I can choose another image from this list. I'm going to show you real quick what this looks like. So let's say I'm going to go with, I don't know, wood darker. So now I have a new texture in there called wood darker. That's what the actual texture is called. So maybe I should name the material to match it. We'll call it wood darker. And if I want to change this wood texture to the wood darker, I could select all and then unselect these areas because I don't want to undo all of that work. And select wood darker and assign. And now you can see it's got a darker shade of wood on there. I'm going to unhide everything, and we're going to start from scratch with basically going to make a wooden board with a spike through it. Something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and create a new cube. So I'm going to scale on the Z to bring it down in size. I'm going to go to about 0.1. Scale it on the Y by about 2. Scale it on the X by about 0.2 to make it look kind of like a board. And then we need to unwrap this. So I'm going to select all, click on U, and Cube Projection. Now I can come over here and add a new material slot and choose one of those textures from this list. I'm going to choose wood. Now the reason why it looks all elongated and stretched is because I did my scaling in object mode. You can fix this by going back to object mode, and let me just turn this on real quick so you can see what's happened. The scale has all been changed here. So what we need to do is reset that or reapply it. So go over here and reset the rotation and scale. It will still look stretched because you got to go back over here and unwrap it again with Cube Projection. Now it doesn't look stretched anymore. Let's go back to the Materials tab and continue. So the problem right now is we want to put a cut end over here and over here. So let's go ahead and create a slot for that and choose cut end from the list and then assign. And these need to be flipped so that they're going in this direction rather than this direction. That's easy, but we have to do that from the UV editing window. So let's jump over here, and you can see that because I have only those selected, it's already selected over here. I'm just going to rotate that 90 degrees, and that fixes that problem. And that's it. We now have a board. I'm going to go do something very similar to create a spike. Start with a cube. I'm going to scale it down to about 0.05, which is very small. Scale the Z to about 10. And let's go down here, select the bottom, and scale that down to about 0.1. So it looks like a spike. Go back to object mode. And remember, because I did all my editing in object mode, I need to reset the scale. You can avoid this, by the way, by just doing all your scaling in edit mode. You don't have to reset if you do it that way. So go over here and reset the rotation and scale, or technically I'm applying rotation and scale. And you can see that what that does is it resets this all back to ones. So let's go ahead and put the material on this. And this is going to be the iron material. There's no UVs on this yet, so we've got to go over here and select all and unwrap with cube projection. And now you can see the iron on that spike. I'm going to rotate it a little bit on the Z, duplicate it, and just move it along the Y-axis, and then maybe rotate that on the Z so that we have different angles, and then duplicate that and grab it and move it on the Y-axis over here, and maybe rotate it on the Z again. You end up with all this stuff. Select all of this and join it all together. Let's go into edit mode and select all, go over to the UV, and look at the mess of geometry that we've created. We did most of this without even looking at the UV, and it all looks pretty good. So cube projection can save you a lot of time. Using it with seamless textures seems to make the most sense, but anything outside of that, I highly recommend finding another way to do your unwrapping. But if you're interested in learning more, and I mean a lot more, stick around, because I'm going to be showing you a lot of cool tricks and tools that you can use to build up your confidence with UV unwrapping so that you can put some really nice textures on your models and be taken seriously as a video game developer. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this little lecture and maybe learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, be sure to use the discussions, and I'll see you in the next lecture.